Well, welcome everyone. We're really delighted to have Margaret Roberts here today as a keynote at our symposium. And we're going to be focusing on why powerful knowledge is not enough. And its power depends upon powerful pedagogy. So just some preliminary comments before I hand over to Margaret Roberts. And firstly, powerful knowledge is said to be more than everyday knowledge in that it takes young people beyond their everyday experiences. Curriculum makers are compelled to come up with programs that are powerful, yet this means different things to different people. Alaric Maud is a leading researcher in this area, and we've heard from him in this symposium. He has analysed geography's powerful contribution to powerful knowledge and provides 5 types of powerful knowledge in geography education, has outlined them in his interview in this e-symposium. In these categories, Alaric signals knowledge types that can be viewed as signalling particular orientations to pedagogy, or perhaps they are pedagogical. So Alaric identifies 5 types of knowledge: knowledge that provides students with new ways of thinking about the world, knowledge that provides students with powerful ways of analysing, explaining and understanding. Thirdly, knowledge that gives students some power over their own geographical knowledge. Fourthly, knowledge that enables young people to follow and participate in debates on significant local, national and global issues. And finally, knowledge of the world. And this brings us to Margaret Roberts' address: why powerful knowledge is not enough. The power depends upon powerful pedagogy. Margaret, I'd like to start by asking you, what do you mean by powerful pedagogy?
Well, pedagogy refers to what happens in the classroom or in geography and fieldwork, in interactions between teachers and students. What's written on curriculum documents isn't powerful on its own. It's only powerful if something actually happens in the minds of students. And even a more recent thing that Michael Young's written, he called it potentially powerful. And so anything that's in curriculum documents is only potentially powerful, and it's what happens in classrooms that makes it powerful. So I think it's powerful if the kinds of knowledge that Alaric suggests actually, if students develop those things, if they develop new ways of thinking, if they develop new skills, although Michael Young hardly refers to skills, but some of the things that Alaric mentioned I'd call skills rather than knowledge. And additionally, if those types of knowledge endure beyond school, if they're not just for exams, in my view, they're not just for tests. And in addition, there's something beyond knowledge, which I'd say geographical education is powerful, and I wouldn't call this knowledge. If students develop an ongoing curiosity, a sense of wonder, that's not a knowledge, it's a kind of attitude towards the world. So I don't think geographical education is only about knowledge, it's about inspiration. And I'd like to finish answering this question with a quote from Jerome Bruner. He wrote in The Culture of Education, because this is the enduring aspect: we carry with us habits of thought and taste fostered in some nearly forgotten classroom by a certain teacher. So I think it's something that endures if it's powerful, but it's turning the ideals and things that are written in curriculum documents into something that makes a difference to students.
Thank you, Margaret. We'll move on to the second question. Michael Young has downplayed the value of everyday knowledge. How is existing and everyday knowledge important to powerful pedagogy?
Well, interestingly, he quotes Vygotsky. I've been influenced by Vygotsky and constructivist thinking. And but he just uses Vygotsky's ideas on what Vygotsky calls scientific knowledge. And Vygotsky identified two types of knowledge: spontaneous knowledge, which is like everyday knowledge built on experience, and scientific knowledge, which I suppose Michael Young would call powerful knowledge. But what Vygotsky, he did lots of experiments, and he found that the development of the scientific knowledge depended on using the spontaneous knowledge that children had. They only acquired it if they could relate it to what they already knew. But that in turn, he saw it as a two-way process, that in turn, the new scientific knowledge enhanced and enabled everyday concepts to be developed. So it was really important. And so it's Vygotsky influenced me, but I was interested in an academic book for university graduates by Cloak, Cry and Goodwin, who emphasised at the beginning of the course their everyday knowledge. And they wrote, so I'll read this: beware, aware of the human geographies wrapped up in and represented by the food you eat, the news you read, the films you watch, the music you listen to, the television you gaze at. So everyday knowledge. And think about how what you read in books or articles connects or doesn't with your everyday life and what that might be. And I think that applies in school, because nearly everything that we study in geography, I think we're a fortunate subject, students have experience of. You know, they make journeys, they eat food from different places, where they live, they move about their environment. And so that knowledge can be used. And to dismiss it as rather trivial, I think, is important. And I think there are implications for this for practice. And I'll just give you an example of how I used to start my PGC course. The very first week, we visited a school in the northern part of Sheffield, where 90% of the students were from various ethnic minorities: Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Caribbean, Somalian. And there were very few just white Sheffield children. And the students' task, we took over a class, and the students' class was just to listen. And they were scared. They said, for a whole hour, they said, what if the children don't talk? I said, don't worry, they will talk. And what they had to find out was what the students knew about Sheffield, what they knew about the United Kingdom, and what they knew about the world. And they could use maps and everything. No students ever ran out of time. Well, they ran out of time. I said, if you are getting short of time, leave out the United Kingdom, because they're often very interesting on the world. So they did that for an hour, and some of the students did try to mark things on maps. And then we spent the afternoon debriefing that. The emphasis was that these children, the teacher said, oh, they won't know anything about Pakistan. They haven't been there. Half the Pakistani origin children whose parents had been born there had been there. And it'd been the first opportunity. They were 11-year-olds to talk about it. Some of them hated it and found it was very dirty and not as nice as Sheffield. And some of them loved it and felt at home there. And it got rid of stereotypes. They found that not all the children felt the same. Some girls weren't allowed out. Some girls were allowed freedom to go to the shops. They found out about how they spent the evenings going to the mosque and learning prayer. They found out about where they'd been in Sheffield. One of them, in the afternoon, one of them said, they don't have a rural Britain, do they? They only go through the country areas to get to Manchester Airport or to go and visit relations. And they don't have holidays, they go and stay with relations. And I think it was very important to know where those pupils are coming from, what their world is like, and respecting it. And the pupils, absolutely, they always love it. And I used to put on my wall for that first week, I think it was there all the time, only connect. Only connect. You have to connect with the children's what they're at. It's a different thing. They didn't know the world that the students lived in. They said they don't know our part of it. They'd never heard of Crooks or where the students mostly live. But one enduring result of that thing that's I said that powerful knowledge, powerful PGC courses ought to endure. I met a student 2 years ago, an ex-student who'd been on the course years and years ago, and I said, "Oh, where are you teaching now?" She said, "Oh, I'm at Sheffield Hallam University in the careers department." And she said, "What I remember is all your group work and only connect." And she's called her career, the careers service, which she now runs, Careers Connect. So when you go up to Sheffield station, you see, and I think, well, that's, if I've done nothing else, she just thought it was so important to connect.
So, Margaret, our third question to you today is, how can geography transform the way students see the world? Or in other words, how do we give young people access to the ways in which academic geographers think?
Right. I think that what students need to do in the classroom is the kind of things that geographers do, but in a obviously more simplified way. They have to be aware of the kinds of questions that geographers ask, and teachers can shape the kind that make them aware of that. They use the kind of data that geographers use. It's not just, I don't think they should learn just the conclusions. The textbooks I had when I was at school, it was all general, and you didn't have any data. You didn't have the data on which any knowledge was based. And then they have a chance to reach conclusions. And an example I've used quite a lot in workshops related to climate change. And so a question might ask, what's happening to glaciers? Are they all retreating? And you could refine that question, but that some of the data, you can get data quite easily online about what's happening in the United States. And then the European Environment Agency has published reports on it with what's happening to 15 glaciers in Europe between 1945 to 2015. And that data, that's on a graph, and it's quite accessible for students. But instead of telling them what's happening, they can look at the kind of data. Yeah. So what's happening? And to help them think about it, I devised an activity which I call 5 key points. What are the 5 most important points you can make about this data? I mean, it could be 5 or 6, but I call it 5 key points. And get them to do it, first of all, in pairs or small groups, and then share it. So they're doing what geographers do. What does this data tell us? And what's interesting about the data is that all the glaciers, except 3, are retreating every year. Get shorter and shorter. But there are 3 in Norway that aren't, that are growing. So at that stage, the data doesn't explain why to the teacher. So the role of the students is to look at that data and reach the kind of conclusions that geographers might make from it. But then I think an important thing is learn to qualify rather than, when it's the kind of thing that students find difficult, to what extent? Because it's true for all but 3. And then the teacher might have to speculate on why Norway might be different. And it's different because it's warmer and more snow can accumulate there because the air can hold more water. I haven't seen figures after with 2015, the figures I used. But I think you use the kind of questions geography asks, the kind of data that geography would use that's simple enough to be used in the classroom, and try to get them to reach conclusions. And then everything needs explaining. That might be added with more transmission teaching, or get them to speculate and then the teacher to explain why.
You're taking them through the characteristic ways that geographers think, but in some ways you're simplifying the data a little bit, and then supporting that with further explanation. But rather than saying, I will tell you how glaciers are retreating or that they are, and they're three that's not, it's getting them to think that through and then to...
Of course, it takes longer, and it depends. Some teachers find there's too much on the syllabus. It takes longer for students to work through that. And you don't have to do it for every bit of information, but I think they need to have experience of thinking like geographers by going through that process.
I'm absolutely in agreement, Margaret. So you also talk about critical skills. Can you tell us about what are critical skills and how can they be developed in school geography?
I think it's probably asking questions beyond the factual what, where, why, right answer questions, but asking questions certainly with what might happen, what ought to happen, and I think you're going to ask me about values. And so with the questions, it may be asking some different types of questions. I'm going to talk in a minute about Socratic questions. When looking at the data, and particularly now on the internet, how credible is it? How reliable is it? Is it false news? Is it accurate? Is it biased? Is there only one set of data, or are other points of view considered? And what other data would be useful? So I think the critical skills particularly come with data, not just accepting that everything that's in a newspaper, on a web page, in a textbook is true, but asking, well, how do we know this is true? Because I think powerful knowledge depends on knowledge being reliable, but how do we know? And I think the glacier data from the European Environmental Agency, it's a scientific report and it's validated. But a lot of information isn't. So I think being critical is doing that. And then making reasonable arguments about it and evaluating it. But I think Socratic questions are very interesting for being critical. They include questions that probe assumptions. Is that always the case? Which is the question you need to ask about the glaciers. How do we find they're printed out somewhere and they're very useful because they raise the things that I've already said. How can we find out if that's true or accurate? What's the source? Are these reasons a good enough explanation? And what different ways are they looking at it? And would that necessarily happen? So I think giving students a framework of questions which they've got to hand. They're not geographical, they're generic questions that could be asked for other subjects, but I think they're particularly useful for raising critical questions, but addressing geographical content.
I think that Socratic questions really do have a place in geography and can facilitate those critical skills. Yeah. And it is really about interrogating who is telling us and who has produced the data, and so on and so on. So it's important.
But it's the students who need to have maybe those questions pasted in their book. They need to know the kinds of questions to ask. It's supporting them with a framework of questions, but those are the kind of questions, as well as the geographical questions. It's the questions about assumptions or bias,
and bringing them back to those questions regularly is what you're emphasising, because so that they become an everyday part of the way they think as they're examining knowledge or information. Powerful knowledge emphasises accepted, reliable knowledge, but much of what is studied in geography includes controversial decisions. How important is the values dimension to powerful knowledge?
That's a really tricky question, because I think controversial issues are very important in studying geography. They're very important in geographical education. I'm not sure what powerful knowledge, reliable knowledge, means in relation to the study of controversial issues, because there are conflicting views and those people advocating those views put forward different reliable knowledge. So what's reliable knowledge on, say, coal mining in Queensland? Or is that still an issue?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. There is reliable knowledge about it, but people choose different bits of it. And Michael Young was a scientist, and people who've written about powerful knowledge haven't really addressed these kind of controversial issues. And I think they're terribly important, because lots of things have been determined by decisions in the past about things which were controversial, the routes of railways in England, lots of decisions about town planning were controversial, and there are loads of really important geographical issues now that are controversial. And I think we need to help students understand them by being aware of the different value positions. And the structure I've provided for this always is thinking of those value positions as emphasising economic values, emphasising social values, and emphasising environmental, even if they overlap a bit. And people draw on different lots of evidence. And the way I've used it with PGC courses and the courses I ran in Singapore were through simulated public meeting role play, where there's a session, first of all, preparing for it. And then in Singapore, it had to be done in 40 minutes because that was the length of lessons there. And then a debriefing afterwards. It's time consuming, but very involving. And what I did in Singapore was an issue that was in 2011, was an issue that was very alive in Mauritius at the time. My daughter's in-laws live in Mauritius. So I was going to visit Mauritius, so I was aware of this. And Mauritius government wanted to expand the tourist industry from about 10,000 visitors a year to 20,000. That sounds very small, by 2020. And it was a big issue there. And there were groups in favour. There were, the government wanted to do it, it brought in revenue. The Tourism Authority wanted to bring it, and they argued an economic case. They were going to do all these wonderful environmental things, and hoteliers who wanted the money. And then against it were some local people who feared that the tourists were taking all the beachfront areas and spoiling the country. There was a group that was against flying, didn't want it. And then there were the environmental people who were very, very concerned about the coral reefs, what were happening to them, which was not only climate change, but damage from tourists. And they argued it out. I ran it 10 times in Singapore. And the people really got into it. They had their data. So again, they had their questions, they had the data, they all had some common data, and then they all had some extra data that they could use. And the ones that were the strongest were always the environmentalists against, and very persuasive. And I ran it 10 times, and every single time, the economic case for won. I don't know if that was because it was done with Singaporean teachers, or I have read that the economy always wins out somehow. And we've had similar debates with expansion of Heathrow Airport, and great debates, but the economy always wins. And then you debrief it. And I was building on what I did with PGC students. I always ran a session on some current issue as part of the course. And then it was a requirement that they had to do it in school and with students, and talk about a slightly enduring impact. I watched a role play on should the Narmada Dam be built in. This is years ago in India, and I think it had already been built. And these students were from a pit village, coal mining village in Rotherham, and it was so distant from them. But they got really involved. I was introduced as a journalist from a newspaper in Rotherham, and I did have to, they got so heated, I had to intervene and say, well, I need for my notes to hear everyone speak. And they must have debriefed after in the next lesson. About 3 weeks later, I visited that school, and 2 girls ran up to me. They saw my car parking. I was going to visit another class, and they said, "We was right, miss, wasn't we? We were right. The Derby shouldn't have been built." And they'd never done that about any other lesson. So I think they're very vivid, they're very memorable, and I think all my students continued to use them. So, and it worked in Singapore. But more recently, I've done something last year, I think it was, with a group of teachers, and everything's set out for them in an academy chain. And they said, "Oh, we haven't got time to do things like that because we haven't got time to talk because there's too much on the syllabus." But I think controversial issues you need to really delve into. Some of them were, all the role plays I've used, they have some data in common. So which is the reliable data? I don't know where powerful knowledge fits in, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be taught in geography.
Engaging with controversial issues is essential in geography. You're absolutely right. How you construct that within the notion of powerful knowledge is challenging, but its absence is a problem.
I think teachers back in the 70s were accused of being biased or anything, but I think actually having a role play, the teacher isn't, you enable them to argue it out. You're not taking a side. Sometimes we had in a PG session about nuclear power in England, and they said, I said, "I'm not saying anything." With the oldest, they were in their 20s. At the end, I told them my view. They said, "What do you think?" But I think it isn't the teacher's job to influence the students. It's to make sure they use the data they've got and argue well from it. And at school level, I'm not sure I would say what I thought.
I tend to not tell my students what I'm, if I have a position. But I think the more you study these issues and the more data you're exposed to, even if you have a preferred position, you often can see those other perspectives or have some understanding of them. So it becomes more difficult to think, I know. Yeah.
But I think the Michael Gove, who was Minister of Education, and from the last Secretary of State for Education during the last thing, disapproved of values. And he didn't even want climate change on it. He thought it was he didn't want controversy. And he had very much the idea that it was just about transferring reliable knowledge. And I don't think what I've read on powerful knowledge, Alaric mentions taking part in debates, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. But I don't think a lot of it doesn't include what you do with all this conflicting knowledge where there are different viewpoints.
Yeah, Alaric certainly does say that students can follow and participate in debates on significant local, national and global issues, which is perhaps a slightly gentler framing than controversial, but these debates are pretty heated and they're sometimes very polarised, and but the decisions that these young people will make will change the world. So they're important.
And you have to, I emphasise to students, you have to spend as long debriefing them. And debriefing is very difficult. I found that people were very reluctant to shift from their positions that they'd argued very strongly, because they wanted to hold on to that because that's what they've been fighting for. But you need to debrief and either get them to summarise someone else's point of view, discuss why that decision was made. But when I ran the course in Singapore, the course included it was 2.5 days, and it was towards the end, and the teachers all absolutely loved it. Whether they carried on in their schools, I don't know, doing it. but it was one of the sessions I really looked forward to because they came into their own.
I suspect they would remember it well, and I hope they would have taken it back into their classrooms, because they would have had the same powerful experiences with their students, the memorable experiences. This leads us to discuss what is the role of the student, which goes hand in hand with the role of the teacher in powerful pedagogy.
The role of the student is to be involved actively in activities which are to enable them to think like a geography, to think through. And the teacher is supports, guides. There are some things in an inquiry approach which students don't necessarily find out for themselves, explanations, and some things need to be taught, maybe directly. You don't find out how glaciers are retreating or anything from looking at the data, for example. But I think they need to be actively involved. And I think classroom talk is very important. In my first school I taught in, Douglas Barnes was head of English, and he influenced me probably more than any geographer. And he got me involved in the London Association of Teaching English and the importance of talk, and not closed questions and answers, but the need to discuss and sort out ideas. And he introduced me to small group work, which I used in all my PGC sessions, and which the person running careers at Sheffield Hallam now, her Only Connect thing, she said, the other thing I use, small group work. So these are generic ideas about pedagogy, but to sort out ideas, not to assume that you can just pour things into a student's head and they immediately understand it. So they need to be able to ask questions, share ideas. And one of the things that Douglas Barnes did after he was teaching in a school, he did a research project and tried to identify the different ways that teachers worked with students. And he called it the participation dimension. And at one end, it was very controlled. The teacher told everyone what to do, and they followed instructions, and they did what they wanted. I'll give you a geography example in a minute. And then at the other end, students developed their own ideas and were free, and he called, but with teacher support, and that was negotiated. And I've used this a lot in my books and in my teaching. And the recent book I've written about, a written chapter about using the World Wide Web, applied it to that. But the examples I can give you at the closed end, my son did geography GCSE, and the teacher decided, she controlled exactly what they did. It was fieldwork, and they were going to investigate different shopping centres. So they all went in groups to different shopping centres to show that what they found out matched what was in the textbook. And they had the teacher devised the questionnaire, they did the questionnaire, the teacher told them what graphs to draw, and they did the graphs. And I think the teacher fudged some of the statistics which didn't actually match what they should have done. The teachers followed the thing, and they reached the conclusion that the teacher wanted to. That's at the extreme closed end. And I'm not sure they learned a procedure, but that is closed. In contrast, he also did A-level geography. And for his A-level project, he had to choose something. And at that time, there was a local issue about Tesco wanting to build a new huge supermarket on a place that was then a cricket ground. And he read about that and he said, I'm going to investigate that. And over half term, there was a public inquiry meeting, which he went to, and he got he was very studious, he got piles and piles of documents. And then he went round interviewing and went door to door to find out why there were two groups against it, and he tried to find out why there were two groups and what they were and what should do. He was investigating a controversial issue. But the teacher had to support it. He had a kind of framework devised by the exam board of what you had to do. You had to set out the question, you had to do your data, you had to analyse it, and you had to reach conclusions. So it's supported with some kind of framework, but it was really at the negotiated end. And in the middle, I think there's work that's framed by the teacher. I'll give you two examples. One that I used in the book on using the internet was from a student who was getting the students to find out about hurricanes. And they studied one hurricane together as a class. So they learned the kinds of questions that geographers ask about it, the kinds of data that's important to geographers, and how to write it up. And then they were given a choice. You could choose any within that, but they were framed. You can choose any hurricane you like. But some of the students needed more support than that. So he suggested 5. They'd spend hours and hours on the internet and not find a suitable one. So he suggested 5 where he knew there was good data. And then others chose it. And that's giving students some choice, but in a framework to make their own decisions. And they have more chance to participate then, I think. I watched a lesson where students were, the students that don't come and watch this lesson, they're all finishing their project on computers on volcanoes. And I said, oh, fine. And I went in and they were all, again, like the hurricane thing, they'd studied a volcano together. They knew how to study volcanoes. And I went round and they said, my volcano, I'm being gory 40-year-olds, it killed so many people in such a year, or my volcano hasn't erupted for so long. And the motivation for having some choice within a framework, I think, was really important. So I think the pupil's role is not just to go down a narrow track decided in advance by a teacher, but to give them some scope for exploration.
Framing or bounded choice is a good way not to throw the student in the deep end of knowledge, but deep enough that they get to paddle, but could make their way to the end of the pool, if you like. This brings us probably to our last question in this keynote, and that is, as we want to develop teachers who can discern powerful knowledge and understand powerful pedagogies, what does this mean for teacher training?
An example I didn't use earlier was a student for interviews in England School for Jobs. They often have to teach a lesson, and this was years ago. This lesson, she said, guess what I've got to teach? The European Union. How can I teach that? Their kids aren't going to be interested. And we invented this. I said, well, what to try this? So we did an intelligent guesswork lesson where she had an inner circle, which were the countries that had been in the EU from the start, and then the next circle from when it got enlarged, and then countries in Europe. I think she had to do, which weren't in it yet. And I said, see if what they know already. So again, building on their everyday knowledge, see what they know already about the thing. And then I actually tried it in a PGC lesson the following year. And what was interesting is some of them knew a lot through football. So they knew it. Some of them some people only wrote a footballer from every country they knew they could name. And then they had fashion and food, where food came from. And then there were lots of, someone wrote tea from Sweden. There were misconceptions as well. And using that kind of starting where they're at with their intelligent guesswork, you can sort out misunderstandings, which is important, but also motivate them. The lesson went really well. She got the job, but it's starting where they're at, and with a good activity, actually try it out with students. So the difference with students, instead of just debriefing the activity, you then debrief it as an activity and say, what are the issues about using this activity in the classroom? What would be the problems? What would you need to make sure you do? Is it worth doing? They don't have to take my word for it. Would you do it or not?
We need to expose our next generation to teachers to the best pedagogies, to allow them to experience those pedagogies, whether it's a role play, the ways in which we work with data, the Socratic questions that we bring in.
Then I used to use intelligent guesswork. So all the things, because some of the activities they won't have experienced as pupils, students themselves in school. So, and some of them don't take very long. Some activities, say looking at the graph of glaciers, you could do that in 10 minutes with university graduates and put them in groups, and then find that they'd chosen different 5 points. And then you might discuss that. But then you get out beyond that to the second debriefing of, so would you use this what would be the problems of using this? How would you use it as a teacher? So I think that's how pedagogy would come into the course. Partly you use it yourself, and I use, with the influence of Doug Barnes, I use loads and loads of small group work, initial discussion in pairs. I had a group of 26, and I found that if you try to have a discussion initially with 26, some of them never talk. There were always some who talk more than others. But putting them in small groups enabled everyone to have their say and feed into the other things.
So you've walked the talk 100% in teacher training, I think, Margaret, and you've also given me a beautiful example of one of your graduates who's gone on to careers education and has taken elements of what they've experienced in teacher training through into their profession. So indeed, I think a great example of what powerful knowledge and what powerful pedagogy can do.
Yeah.
I think it is critically important that we don't assume what experiences our student teachers have when they enter their teacher training, and what preconceptions about learning that they have. And we do give them these rich experiences and debrief those experiences and talk about how they can work and the risks when they don't work well, and how you manage that.
I mentioned this interview to Douglas Barnes, who happened to ring me last week. He's now in his 90s, living in London, supposed to be at my birthday celebrations. But and I said about everyday knowledge and starting where they're at. And he said, that's crucial. You have to start where they're at. You can't, some knowledge in geography is so distant, like the Narmada Dam, but then the teacher had to make sense of it for them. You have to start with their knowledge and build from that, and recognise that otherwise the gap might be too much, in which case it's not powerful at all. If they don't connect, only connect.
Only connect. Well, I think that's a wonderful note perhaps to finish on.